are listening to Therapy Plus, a mental health podcast.
The views and opinions expressed by the guest speaker on this episode are solely those of the guest. The content shared is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice or endorsement.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the effectiveness of CranioSacral Therapy for mental and spiritual health. My name is Michael Morgan. I've been an instructor for the Upledger Institute for the last 25 years, and I have taught this modality nationally and internationally to healthcare professionals. And I've helped to pioneer and coordinate research on craniosacral therapy, and primarily its applications to Alzheimer's dementia. I've written a book called Prevent Alzheimer's in Just 10 Minutes a Day, and I've been a host for the last few years of the Alzheimer's World Summit. I wanted to thank you again for inviting me to speak on this topic, the effectiveness of craniosacral therapy for mental and spiritual health. And as a subtitle, I kind of put how craniosacral therapy, or CST as we call it, is useful for any individual's mental health. And you've allowed me to invite a little prop. Of course, if you can't see this, just imagine this in your mind's eye. But I call it the continuum of mental and spiritual health, from dysfunction to clarity. And for those of you just listening, imagine doing this in your mind's eye, or if you have a piece of blank paper, just write or draw a line. Take a piece of blank paper, all right, as my followers know I want to do, and just draw a straight line from left to right, just from left to right, just a straight line. And over on the far left, write dysfunction. And over on the far right, put bliss, B-L-I-S-S. And somewhere in the middle, maybe 3/4 of the way down the line over to the right, put normal, quote unquote. And if it's not too much to ask, maybe create a little bit of a sidebar which says Alzheimer's dementia, because it's kind of a subset of what we might call, for purposes of this discussion, a little bit of a side aspect of mental and spiritual health. Certainly, it's a certain part of it for sure, but it's also kind of a subset of mental health in general. So we'll draw the line together, or just draw a line in your mind. And over on the left again is dysfunction, and over on the far right is bliss. Somewhere in the middle is normal. All right. So first of all, as a general broad brushstroke, we can kind of discuss what are some of the causes of mental dysfunction, if you will. Borrowing from our research on Alzheimer's dementia and acknowledging Dr. Dale Bredesen that I've worked with and interviewed on this as well, and I think we agree with this to a great degree, is, for example, when we talk about Alzheimer's, it's not just a one-pill solution. There can be 5 major vectors that can contribute to it. That's why it's so hard to develop just a one-shot pharmaceutical for it. It could be inflammation, maybe born of diet over time. And that creates an inflammatory process, neuroinflammation. We'll talk about a bit more in a minute in the body and unfortunately sometimes in the brain. It can be atoxic, meaning there can be hormonal imbalance. We'll touch on that to a greater degree in a minute too. Toxicity is in heavy metals like mercury or aluminum or lead. It could be vascular, as in stroke and heart attack, or it could be trauma of any type, but certainly close head injuries, car accidents, or, physical trauma to the body, any blows to the body or head in any way, shape, or form. And that would, of course, include emotional trauma and a whole variety of subsets, because obviously that affects mental functioning as well, even if it's just been experienced by the body, and certainly our emotions, yes. So let's look at each one of these in detail. And again, as I said before, think of Alzheimer's dementia, and notice the name dementia, as in demented, as a subset of this mental continuum. So what I'd say is there's a commonality between the mental states, including Alzheimer's dementia, and just mental dysfunction, if you will, as well. And so some of these underlying conditions include the following. There can be disease of some type, and it may not be obvious. It may be just subtle and brewing for decades. It could be any kind of disruption of the mental and emotional state. And when we kind of dive into the neurophysiology of this, we find out it could be reflected in a heightened autonomic nervous system, or ANS. Also, what we call the reticular activating system. This structure in the lower part of the brain, and some people say in the upper part of the cervical vertebrae, where basically we're always on alert. I think we all know in this day and age what it's like to be on edge, kind of like waiting for the other shoe to drop. That's part of the RAS, or reticular activating system, where our radar can be maybe not just a little bit triggered, but all the time. That's why it is, for example, 80 million Americans or more have trouble sleeping, because their RAS won't settle down enough for them even to calm down and go to sleep. And as part of a more current discussion, when we think of Stephen Porges and polyvagal theory, a disrupted polyvagal system, ventral and dorsal, talking about the brain and the whole spinal column, how when that's dysregulated, that shows up as physical symptoms as well as psychological symptoms, or it could. So that's kind of a broad brushstroke of some of the precursors or underlying components of, shall we say, mental dysfunction. There's more in terms of causative factor, but that's a start. And I know in my summit, I've also talked about mold and Lyme disease. And that's become a whole nother area of research where functional medicine doctors have looked and seen, wow, there's even areas in that can cause fairly significant mental disruption, even from something that at base is a physiological function. It can just disrupt the physiology. Then we can ask, well, how does CranioSacral Therapy fit or address all of this? My mentor, Dr. John Upledger, who's an osteopath, developed CranioSacral Therapy in the mid-1970s. And in the last 40, 50 years, we've taught over 100,000 practitioners around the world. And we have affiliates over 57 countries. Now it's well over 60 countries where this is taught around the world. And very simply, what CranioSacral Therapy is, there's cranium for the head and sacrum for the sacrum around that tailbone, and then the spinal column in between. In the larger format, CranioSacral Therapy is part of what we call manual therapy, where typically someone lies on a table and they put their hands on the patient and do some kind of what's called manipulation. And most people are familiar with massage therapy. And indeed, a lot of massage therapists learn CranioSacral Therapy because it reduces the wear and tear on their body, because it's a very gentle technique. It only relies on about 5 grams of very gentle, almost baby touch of pressure. And it's done fully clothed, or if someone comes in and wears loose, comfortable clothing, typically they're lying on a massage table. Typically the session lasts for about an hour. And what a therapist does who's trained to listen to the craniosacral rhythm, which is a little more subtle than the heartbeat or the respiratory system, but what they'll do is listen to the body. And they'll listen to the body and find out where things feel tight and where they feel loose. And where they feel tight, they'll do a series of techniques with their hands, sandwiching the body to release the tissue. And on the level of the head, because people hear about cranial for the head and sacrum for the sacrum and the spinal column in between. Again, they can listen to the very subtle movement of the cranial bones and do techniques to actually allow these bones to, in a sense, soften and shift, even where there's been disruption. That's why it's so popular and so useful for concussions. And typically after an hour, what a client will feel, they may not feel very much, but typically what they'll feel after a session is a lot of relaxation, and they'll feel very slowed down. And you can imagine mentally just how relaxing that would be. And so people come in for a variety of reasons. They might come in for headaches or migraines or digestive disorders or lower back complaints. Those are the most common after being in a car accident. And typically they'll come, even if they're more sensitive, for someone who's going to be very gentle with them and listen very respectfully, because that's how we train our therapists to work. Over time, the reason why I got involved with this for memory problems is that after a series of techniques, CranioSacral Therapy, by gentle manipulation, very, very gentle, by just touching the head, it helps clear toxins from the head. And when it does that, that by itself can clear the memory and help in that way. One Dr. Upledger found, and this had been kind of investigated for decades even before he came on the scene in the 60s and 70s. But basically, what he codified in calling this what's called the craniosacral system is there's a pumping action, to keep it simple, of cerebral spinal fluid called CSF. It's like the fluid or the coolant inside the brain and the spinal column that pumps up and down the spine about 4 to 8 times per minute. It's a rhythm that we can actually palpate or teach practitioners how to palpate. We can actually teach them how to put their hands and listen to the head and the body and feel this very subtle rhythm. And we do that because there's other rhythms in the body. There's other oscillations. For example, there's the heartbeat, which doctors and nurses know about. There's also the respiratory rhythm. The cranial rhythm is just a little slower and a little quieter, so it develops a bit more subtlety to tune into it. But this is important because what we found in our research on Alzheimer's dementia, and this crosses into the mental health continuum as well, is that craniosacral therapy helps increase the flow of cerebral spinal fluid to the brain, which helps remove toxins and unwanted proteins, sometimes called amyloid plaques. And CST also can reduce neural inflammation for the brain and other parts of the central nervous system, which can be identified as a leading contributor to memory and cognitive problems. So we have that underlying nervous system, and we have a craniosacral system which has its own rhythm. Now, why this is important is that craniosacral therapy also has a lot to do with lowering the autonomic tone within the individual. In other words, it creates more calmness. In fact, one of our first initial studies in 2008 in researching Alzheimer's dementia in nursing home was that the first order effect was that it lowered agitation. It's called the Cohen-Mansfield Agitation Scale. So we were able to document that one of the first things we noticed is people were calmer. And as we know from someone that has mental agitation, that can be a big factor. But also what's important about craniosacral therapy with this cranial sacral rhythm is what Dr. Upledger observed and noticed, my mentor, is that this cranial sacral rhythm underlies the entirety of the neural, skeletal, muscular system. So it's like pulling a bed sheet. There's 3 bed sheets below the upper ones. And as you kind of palpate or interface with the craniosacral system, it influences structures such as the neural, skeletal, and endocrine system above it. So it has a profound effect because it underlies at a deeper level all these other systems as well. And so in our research and also in our ability and our observations anecdotally, we found that craniosacral therapy can help shift the balance in these areas as well. So also because of without getting too much in the weeds with this, but because of the interconnection of the bones, membranes that underlie the bones, and the hormonal system of the body, craniosacral therapy can have a positive effect on both the immune and endocrine systems as well. One of the researchers, Sutherland, way back in the early 1900s, that started to develop what's called cranial osteopathy, noticed that, wow, when I do this work, this very subtle, quiet work, that it can help shift and reinforce the immune system, and concomitant with that, relating to that, the endocrine system as well, which we know has a lot of crossover when we talk about mental functioning also. And so, for example, one of my fellow instructors, Nikki Kinward, in the UK, has investigated the connection between the brain and the gut and published a book a couple of years ago called Overcoming Chronic Digestive Conditions and Post-Traumatic Gut Disorder. So a lot of people in the mental health field and the neurological field as well are starting to even notice more the gut-brain connection, how the gut, brain, and microbiome the energy and digestive component of the body, also has an effect on our endocrine system and our mental functioning as well, our whole attitude towards life. So I'm just weaving in a little more research to give you an idea, because we found with the craniosacral, that can have a profound effect as well. And as part of what we do in our advanced therapy is not only are we looking at the physiological aspects of palpating or feeling the cranial rhythm, but as part of that, we're also looking at the emotional and even spiritual component, so that we have a way to start to kind of dialogue with the individual and see if they can be complete in some way, even if they've had some overwhelming trauma. And so, as an example of this, in terms of how all this relates to the continuum of mental and spiritual health, we have coordinated research with projects on soldiers with PTSD, individuals who have experienced traumatic events, and a variety of other conditions with the ability to address the emotional component. We've even had teams of therapists go around to people that have had, overwhelming events, which unfortunately seem to be ongoing, whether they be in a school shooting type situation or 9/11 or what have you. So we found that there is a community aspect to what we're doing as far as individuals. And so when we do this advanced work in craniosacral therapy, the result is there being a sense of completion that allows both the body and the mind to enhance the healing and recovery process. And that being said, CST, craniosacral therapy, is not necessarily standalone. Typically it's not, but it can be used in conjunction with psychological and counseling support, helping to support these types of therapies. And of course, the caveat is that we suggest consulting a physician or mental health professional if there are significant conditions in this mental realm, obviously, that need to be addressed. Let's go back to that imaginary line that we drew at the start of the talk, that line that goes from left to right, where we have dysfunction on the left end, normal somewhere in the middle, and over on the right, what we call bliss. All right. So we're talking in a sense of the spiritual component, very briefly. And what I'm saying is that, well, first of all, some people would say, and I'm a long-term teacher, full disclosure, of transcendental meditation too, so I kind of am borrowing for this. But we can say, well, what is bliss? And some people would argue that it's not a mood, but a mental state that arises out of a more balanced, regulated, and calmer body and brain physiology. And as an example of that, this is what my friend Marcy Scheimoff described in her book, Happy for No Reason. Happy for No Reason. And many craniosacral therapy practitioners and clients describe this as a state of profound silence, connectedness with the universe, and again, happy for no reason. But it's not just a mood, it's based on the physiological substrate or platform that supports that experience. And again, all this model again is based on profound physiological balance, which we believe any human being can achieve. So that's just a little snippet, a thought of some of the ideas of that continuum of mental states. If you're interested in knowing more, you can contact me at michael.morgan@preventingalzheimers.com, or you can visit our website at preventingalzheimers.com. So thank you very much for allowing me to share some of these thoughts with you. And again, thank you for this time.